What if the only confession left after war was whispered not by men, but by metal? In the cold ruins of Mannheim, Karl Brenner stood before a captured Sherman tank, its olive hull glinting beneath a shroud of morning frost. He had designed machines like this once, engines of precision and fear, but never one that survived this long, still humming faintly after the world had stopped fighting. Around him the air smelled of rust, smoke, and quiet judgment. Lieutenant Samuel Harris watched from the doorway, notebook in hand, while Karl's trembling fingers traced the welds. "We built with pride," Karl murmured. "They built with purpose. The tank wasn't a trophy. It was a teacher. Each bolt, each spring, each forgiving joint spoke of a nation that valued reliability over ruthlessness." And as the gears clicked beneath his touch, Karl felt a truth pressing in. Maybe justice wasn't decided by who won the war, but by who built with heart. He looked up, meeting Harris' eyes. "We never made them like this," he said softly. "We never made them to last." The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. The next morning, Karl entered the same yard with new resolve. He had spent the night thinking of every design flaw he once called perfection. As he pried open the tank's gearbox, Otto Klein joined him. Thin, pale, 27, male, with restless eyes behind smudged glasses. Otto's voice broke the quiet. "Strange, isn't it? Their machines breathe like ours, but live longer." Karl didn't answer. His mind was lost between bolts and guilt. Lieutenant Harris observed them, noting every motion with studied curiosity. The clatter of tools echoed like confession. When a gear fell, Karl caught it midair, staring at it as though it held judgment. Elsa's voice called faintly from home, reminding him of bread and warmth, but the machine's heart kept him captive. By afternoon, Major Clark arrived. 45. Male British heavyset, with a square jaw and deep lines of authority carved into his face. He surveyed the scene like a judge at trial. "I hope this German isn't rewriting history," he muttered. Harris defended Karl, saying quietly, "He's rewriting conscience." Clark's glare softened only slightly. Karl remained silent, continuing his careful inspection. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple, mixing with grease. The tank's internal design spoke to him in a language he once thought only his nation knew. Simplicity, reliability, mercy. Clark's boots echoed behind him as he left, muttering, "Machines don't need mercy, son." Karl's eyes stayed on the engine, whispering, "Maybe men do." That evening, Elsa found Karl at the table, his hands blackened by oil. "You look like a ghost chasing another ghost," she said softly. Elsa Brenner, 44, female. Auburn hair tied back, pale and graceful in the glow of a small lamp, stood over him with quiet pain. "You admire their tank," she said. "But what do you admire in it? Their victory or their heart?" Karl couldn't answer. His mind spun with gears and morality. "It's not about winning, Elsa. It's about how they built what lasted." Her eyes softened. "Then build something that heals." Outside, faint thunder rolled over the ruins, echoing his silent guilt. Night fell heavy over Mannheim. The tank stood in silence, half disassembled yet somehow alive. Karl returned one last time, lantern in hand. Otto Klein joined him, their breaths visible in the cold. "Do you think justice has a sound?" Otto asked. Karl smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "It sounds like something that still works." They stood together as the lantern light flickered across the tank's metal ribs. Harris appeared in the doorway, silent, watching two former enemies finding truth in steel. Somewhere beyond, a church bell rang once, then faded. The next dawn rose like forgiveness, slow, cold, and uncertain. Karl Brenner, 46. Male, stood at the open tank, the frost on his coat melting as warmth crept into the wrecked yard. Lieutenant Samuel Harris, 32, male, joined him with quiet reverence, a steaming tin of coffee in hand. The tank now lay in pieces, its heart exposed like a confession under light. "You Germans built for perfection," Harris said. "But perfection doesn't survive mud." Carl nodded, eyes fixed on the sturdy American pistons. "Ours broke because we built with fear," he murmured. Otto Klein, 27, male, shuffled nervously, taking notes, trying to understand what fear could do to steel. Across the courtyard, Major Clark, 45, male, watched without a word, arms crossed. The silence between these men said more than history ever could. Truth was not found in victory, but in what one dared to admit. Later that morning, Carl and Harris worked side by side. The quiet rhythm of tools replaced the sound of war. Every bolt turned like a heartbeat. "Strange," said Harris. "You study what defeated you with such patience." Carl replied softly, "Defeat teaches more than pride ever could." Otto stood behind them, his young face reflecting both admiration and unease. He had grown up believing machines were power. Now, he saw they were mirrors. As Carl explained how German tanks prized precision, Harris pointed out the Sherman's forgiving design. It was built, not for glory, but endurance. Between them a strange friendship began to form, made of steel, silence, and shared respect for creation over destruction. By midday, Elsa Brenner, 41, female, came to the factory, carrying bread wrapped in linen. She found Carl still lost in his work. "You look more like a priest than an engineer," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm praying to the only thing that still listens." Elsa placed the bread beside him and glanced at the American officer nearby. "You work with them now?" Carl nodded. "We're not enemies anymore, Elsa. We're craftsmen in ruins." She looked around the broken walls, her auburn hair catching the dusty light. "Craftsmen rebuild," she whispered. "Soldiers only repeat." Harris watched her leave, realizing that sometimes truth wasn't in machines, but in the women who waited while men chased meaning. The next day brought rain. Inside the factory, the rhythmic patter echoed like memory. Carl examined the Sherman's suspension, his mind tracing the difference between purpose and pride. Otto, 27, male, restless and sharp-eyed, asked, "Do you think justice even exists after all this?" Carl paused. "Justice is when something works the way it was meant to," he said, tightening a bolt. Harris watched, thoughtful. "Then maybe justice is mercy," he said. Outside, puddles reflected the broken sky. Inside, a German, an American, and a boy who never fought a battle worked together to rebuild what war had broken. Night fell again. The rebuilt sections of the Sherman gleamed faintly under lantern light. Carl sat beside the tank, his reflection trembling on its metal surface. "You know," he said to Harris, "it's not the machine that frightens me. It's how much of ourselves we put inside it." Harris nodded slowly. "Then maybe what we build is what we become." Otto fell silent, staring at the tank like it might speak. Outside, thunder rolled, echoing the memory of cannons. Inside, the hum of an engine rebuilt with care began to stir, not a machine of war now, but of understanding. The morning fog clung to the ruins like unspoken guilt. Carl Brenner, 46, male, stood beneath a broken arch, staring at the tank that had become his confession booth. Lieutenant Samuel Harris, 32, male, arrived carrying an envelope stamped with the Allied crest. "Orders from London," he said. Carl didn't move. "They want to ship it back," Harris nodded. "For study, they think your notes might help." Carl laughed softly, a dry, bitter sound. "Help who?" "The victors." Harris's gaze held no pride, only understanding. "Maybe the future." Carl exhaled, the frost of his breath fading in the cold air. "Then let the future learn what we forgot. That pride is heavier than steel." In the distance, a faint church bell tolled, each note bending beneath the weight of memory. Inside the factory, Carl gathered his scattered sketches, diagrams of gears, annotations in smudged graphite, pages wrinkled by oil and sweat. Otto Klein, 27th, male, entered quietly, his youthful face drawn thin by exhaustion. "You're sending these to them?" he asked. Carl nodded. "Knowledge isn't guilty, Otto. Only what we do with it," Otto frowned. "But isn't giving them our secret surrender?" Carl's gaze softened. "No, it's repentance." He handed Otto a blueprint marked with careful notes. "Keep one for yourself. Build something honest someday." The younger man lowered his eyes, realizing that the real inheritance of war wasn't glory or power. It was truth, handed from shaking hands to hopeful ones. Later that day, Elsa Brenner, 41st female, arrived carrying a small wooden box. "You forgot your lunch," she said softly, placing it beside his tools. Carl looked up, smiling faintly. "You still believe I'm just building machines?" Elsa's voice trembled. "No. I believe you're trying to rebuild yourself." She brushed dust from his shoulder and glanced at the tank. "Will you ever forgive yourself?" Carl's hands froze over a wrench. "Maybe not. But I can try to understand what we destroyed." The sound of rain returned, soft and endless. Elsa stepped closer, resting her hand on his cheek. "Then understand this. Forgiveness is also a kind of engineering." Evening descended heavy and gold. Major Clark, 45 male, entered with 2 soldiers. "We're moving it tomorrow," he said curtly. Carl looked up from his bench. "You'll destroy what's left of it in the process." Clark scowled. "We're not here to preserve sentiment." Harris stepped forward, voice firm. "Sir, this man's work matters." Clark turned sharply. He built for the Reich. Harris didn't flinch. And now he's building for the truth. Silence. The sound of dripping water echoed through the hall like a slow heartbeat. Finally, Clark nodded stiffly. "You have until dawn." Carl's eyes flickered with quiet determination. "That's enough." The night before the move, Carl stayed awake beside the tank. The lantern flickered, throwing long shadows over metal and memory. Otto slept nearby, head resting on blueprints. Harris sat across the room, writing quiet. "What will you do after this?" Carl asked. Harris shrugged. "Go home, maybe teach. Remind people that even enemies can respect each other." Carl smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's where peace begins." Outside, snow began to fall. Soft, silent, erasing the scars of the yard. For a moment, the world seemed rebuilt, not by power, but by understanding. Carl looked at the tank one last time. "Tomorrow you go," he whispered. "But a part of you stays." The next morning arrived with the heavy stillness of judgment. Carl Brenner, 46 male, watched as soldiers fastened chains around the Sherman tank, preparing it for transport. Lieutenant for Transport Samuel Harris, 32 male, stood beside him, coat collar turned up against the biting wind. "They're taking it away like it's evidence," Carl muttered. Harris nodded. "Maybe it is proof that something better can be built." Major Clark, 45, male, oversaw the loading with cold precision, barking orders. Otto Klein, 27, male, scribbled nervously in his notes. The tank groaned as the crane lifted it, its metal body creaking like it remembered every life it had carried. Carl stepped closer, eyes wet with something he refused to call sorrow. "Even machines stand trial," he whispered. As the tank disappeared into the mist, Carl felt his chest tighten. The yard seemed emptier than ever. Harris placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good work, Carl." The older man shook his head. "Work isn't justice." Harris looked down. "Then what is?" Carl turned to face him, eyes hollow yet alive. "Justice is when you face what you've built and still choose to build again." In that moment, their silence was more intimate than friendship. Otto stood by the doorway, watching two men from opposite worlds share a truth that war could never destroy. That evening, Carl sat alone in his small home. Elsa Brenner, 44, female, entered quietly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've taken it," she asked. Carl nodded without looking up. "It's strange," he murmured. "I spent years designing tanks that killed. But this one taught me how to live." Elsa's eyes filled with both pride and fear. "Then let that be your atonement," she said gently. Carl looked up, the lamplight casting soft lines across his face. "Do you think atonement ever ends?" Elsa shook her head. "Only if you stop feeling." Outside, the wind howled through broken chimneys, carrying the sound of forgotten prayers. The next day, Carl and Harris were summoned to a provisional Allied tribunal in Frankfurt. The hall was cold, filled with echoing footsteps and uneasy silence. Carl sat before a long wooden table, hands clasped. Major Clark presided, eyes sharp as steel. "Herr Brenner," he began, "you designed weapons for a regime that destroyed millions. Why should we trust your intentions now?" Carl met his gaze. "Because even a man who built destruction can learn from what endures." Clark leaned back. "And what endures? Mercy," Carl said simply. Harris watched, proud yet pained. For the first time, Carl spoke not as an engineer, but as a man seeking justice within himself. When the hearing ended, the verdict was not punishment, but silence, a freedom heavier than guilt. Outside, Harris waited for Carl on the courthouse steps. Snow began to fall again, soft and endless. "What now?" Harris asked. Carl smiled faintly. "Now I build something that lasts." Elsa stood across the square, her auburn hair glinting beneath the snowfall, eyes shining with quiet pride. Otto joined them, notebook under his arm. Together they walked into the white streets of Frankfurt, three souls bound by truth instead of war. Above them, the snow covered the world evenly. No victor, no vanquished, only men learning how to be human again. Weeks passed. The tank had been sent to London, its parts studied, its secrets catalogued. But Carl Brenner, 46, male, remained restless. In the workshop he now shared with Otto Klein, 27, male, he began building again. Not weapons, but tools. The sound of hammers replaced the echo of guns. Lieutenant Samuel Harris, 32, male, returned to visit, stepping into the quiet rhythm of creation. "You're back to building?" he asked. Carl looked up, smiling faintly. "This time, it's for living men." Harris nodded, running his hand across a half-finished plowshare. "So that's what justice looks like," he murmured. Outside, the bells of a nearby church tolled noon. The same hands that once forged machines of war now shaped the bones of peace. That afternoon, Elsa Brenner, 41, female, entered carrying a small bundle of food. She smiled softly as she saw Carl and Otto working side by side. "It's good to see you covered in something other than guilt," she said. Carl laughed, a sound rare and sincere. "Guilt builds nothing, Elsa. Work does." She placed the bundle on the table and glanced at Harris. "Will you take him away again?" Harris shook his head. "No, this time he's free to stay." For a brief moment, the room felt whole again. A place not haunted by what was lost, but healed by what remained. A letter arrived from London. Harris brought it himself. It was from an Allied engineer thanking Carl for his notes on mechanical reliability. They had used his suggestions to improve factory designs. "You've done more for peace than you ever did for war," Harris said quietly. Carl held the letter with trembling fingers. "Funny," he whispered, "how truth travels further than bullets." Otto grinned faintly. "And it hits slower, but it stays." The three men shared a look of quiet triumph, the kind born not from conquest but from repair. Outside, Children's laughter floated through the street for the first time in years. That night, Carl sat outside under the stars, Elsa beside him. The quiet hum of the city rebuilding filled the distance. "Do you ever think machines have souls?" she asked. Carl smiled faintly. "No, but the men who build them do." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then promise me you'll build only for those souls now." "I promise," he whispered. Above them, the faint glow of the northern lights painted the sky. A strange beauty, born of cold and chaos. Carl closed his eyes, hearing only peace where there once was thunder. At dawn, the workshop doors opened again. Carl, Otto, and Harris stood together before their latest creation. A farming engine built from the reclaimed parts of a Sherman tank. "Out of war. Life," Carl whispered. Harris nodded. "And out of guilt, Grace." As the machine roared softly to life, the first rays of sun cut through the window, washing the room in light. Elsa appeared in the doorway, smiling with tears she didn't hide. Carl turned to her, eyes calm. "It works," he said. "Finally, something that lasts." And in that moment, the old engineer's hands, sons used to destroy, had finally found their justice. Spring arrived in Mannheim like a quiet apology. The ruins softened under green vines, and the air no longer smelled of ash. Carl Brenner, 46, male, stood outside his rebuilt workshop, wiping his hands on a rag darkened by years of labor. The farming engine hummed nearby, driven by a farmer testing its strength. Lieutenant Samuel Harris, 32, male, had returned once more, his Allied coat replaced by a simple civilian jacket. "So, this is where your war ends," he said with a smile. Carl nodded, watching the machine plow the earth cleanly. "Not ends," he murmured. "Begins again, differently." Harris watched the steel teeth turn soil instead of graves, and for the first time the sound of metal brought comfort, not fear. That afternoon, Otto Klein, 27, male, approached Carl with excitement. "They're asking for our design in Berlin," he said breathlessly. Carl looked up from his desk, smiling gently. "Ours," Otto nodded eagerly. "Your name first." Carl shook his head. "No, ours. A new world doesn't need old titles." Harris chuckled from the doorway. "You've changed, Carl." "No," Carl replied. "I've just learned to build without anger." The three men shared a rare laugh that echoed across the courtyard, scattering the silence that had ruled for too long. Outside, the fields shimmered golden under the sun. A world turning forward again. Later, Elsa Brenner, 41st female, stood by the window watching the new engine roll toward the fields. Carl joined her, resting his hands on the windowsill. "Do you ever miss the past?" she asked softly. "Only when I forget what it cost," he said. She turned to him, her auburn hair catching the light. "Then promise me this. Whatever you build next, let it have a heart." Carl smiled, nodding. "I already did." Their reflections merged in the glass, framed by a world healing in slow motion. Somewhere beyond the hills, church bells began to ring again. Not for victory, but for peace. At dusk, Harris prepared to leave. His time in Germany was over. "You'll visit?" Carl asked. "Someday," Harris replied, tightening his travel bag. "But I think you've got enough to keep you honest." They shook hands, the gesture carrying more truth than any treaty. "Take care of the world, Carl," Harris said. "It's in better hands now." Carl smiled faintly. "We both know it's in all our hands." As Harris walked away down the dirt road, Otto and Elsa stood beside Carl, watching him fade into the amber horizon. The war had ended long ago, but this was the real goodbye. Not between nations, but between who they had been and who they had become. That night, Carl stayed in the workshop alone. He lit a small lamp, its glow flickering across his old blueprints. Between the drawings of engines and machines, he placed a single note. "We never built reliability like this until we built with conscience." He folded it neatly and slid it into a wooden drawer. Then he stepped outside, looking up at a sky clear of smoke for the first time in years. The night air was calm, carrying the faint hum of the farming engine still running in the distance. Carl closed his eyes and whispered, "Justice isn't a verdict. It's what you build when no one's watching." The wind rustled softly through the grass, carrying his words away into the night. Years later, the workshop had changed. Green ivy climbed its walls, and laughter echoed where silence once lived. Otto Klein, 27. Then, now 34, male, guided a group of young apprentices through the room where the first farming engine still stood, weathered but proud. "This is where it began," he said softly. One apprentice asked, "Did he ever regret the war?" Otto smiled faintly. He regretted not learning sooner. Outside, the fields stretched far and golden, alive with the machines Carl built to heal what he once helped destroy. In every turn of metal and soil, a quiet truth endured. Forgiveness had become function, and creation had replaced conquest. At the edge of the field, Elsa Brenner, 41 then, now 49, female, tended a small garden. The years had softened her, but not dimmed her strength. A young boy ran to her carrying a small mechanical toy, one Carl had built for him before he passed. "It still works," the boy said proudly. Elsa knelt, brushing dirt from his hands. "That's because it was built to last." She gazed toward the horizon where the sun touched the fields her husband had helped restore. "He built machines," she whispered, "but he repaired souls." The wind carried her words across the grass, as if the earth itself remembered his promise. In London, Lieutenant Samuel Harris, 32, then now 40, male, walked through a quiet museum filled with relics of war. In the center stood the restored Sherman tank, a plaque beneath it reading, "Dedicated to the engineers who found conscience in creation." Harris stopped before it, hand resting on cold steel. "You taught me something, old friend," he murmured. "That truth can survive even after the noise stops." A child nearby asked his father, "Who built it?" The man replied, "A German who learned peace." Harris smiled faintly, his reflection shimmering on the polished armor. "Two nations, one lesson, carved into metal that once divided them." Back in Mannheim, Otto placed a framed photograph on the workshop wall. Carl Brenner, 46, male, gray-streaked hair and weary smile, standing beside Elsa and Harris in front of the first rebuilt engine. Beneath it, a small inscription read, "Built with heart, not fear." Otto stepped back, eyes glistening. Around him, new apprentices forged tools, repaired engines, and spoke of peace, as if it were the only language left. The air smelled not of oil or smoke, but of purpose. And though Carl was gone, his presence filled every corner, as if every bolt still remembered his trembling hands. At sunset, the camera drifts across the same field where Carl once stood, now alive with crops and quiet joy. A distant engine hums gently, not a weapon's roar, but the steady breath of life rebuilt. Elsa walks along the edge, her hand brushing the tall grain. Otto and the apprentices wave from the workshop porch. Overhead, the sky burns with gold and rose, the world at peace for the first time in memory. Carl's voice echoes softly, timeless and sure. "We never built reliability like this, until we built with conscience." The frame holds for a moment, still and bright, then fades to black. Justice, at last, has become creation.